Hey biology, so today we're going to go ahead and talk about ecology, and that's to start us off. We're going to go into chapter 3. Okay, so if you remember from cell bio, we started talking about, we break down the cell into basically its smallest unit. So the smallest unit that make up a cell is the atom. So atoms are made from the periodic table, or we find them on the periodic table. Atoms make up molecules. Molecules then make up organelles, which we find then in the cell. And then organelles make up cells. Cells then make up similar cells that work together, are tissues. And then tissues make up, or different tissues make up organs. Or different organs make up the organ systems. And then finally, our organ systems make up our organisms. So that's actually the first level that we start talking about when we start discussing ecology. So in ecology, we start off with the organisms. And then organisms of the same species are going to make up a population. And so in your notebook, what you should really do is go ahead and copy this picture, or at least like the circles in the picture. So you see the individual, then the population, community, ecosystem, biome, and biosphere, because you need to know that succession, smallest to largest. So different populations that are found in the same area or that live together, we would call that a community. And then all organisms that live in a place together and their non-living environments, those are ecosystems. Ecosystems that have similar climates and similar communities, we call those our biomes. And then our biomes, okay, all the biomes around the Earth make up our biosphere. So again, you should know that series. So you should know that it goes from individuals all the way then to biomes, to the largest. So organisms so similar to one another that they can breed and produce fertile offspring or viable offspring, we call those species. So we've already heard this term when we've talked about it a lot, but now we're going to start talking about it, how species interact with other species and so forth. So again, our example, a horse plus a donkey create a mule. We consider them different species because the mule is not necessarily, or cannot produce viable offspring. And so horse and donkey, different species. The scientific study of interactions of organisms with each other and their environment, again, we call ecology. The portion of the planet in which all life exists, hopefully you know this, is our biosphere. So that bio meaning life, and the sphere just being one of the spheres of the world. So this is going to include land, water, and the atmosphere, because we're dealing with just life and what life interacts with. Okay, so what shapes an ecosystem? Well, some of the things that shape are the biotic factors. So all the living things within the ecosystem. So bio meaning, again, life factors. So the living factors within that ecosystem. Also the non-living factors that affect an organism. So the climate, temperature, sunlight. And we would call those our abiotic factors. So a habitat, that's the area where an organism is going to live. So a rattlesnake lives in the desert in the American Southwest. So habitat is where an organism lives. A niche is a place it lives plus its abiotic and biotic factors. So niche basically is like its job. So where it lives plus what it eats. What eats its. Where in its habitat it lives. Its actions, hibernating, migrating, etc. So when we think about the difference between the two, and we're going to get into this actually later in chapter 4, we still want to think about habitat as being an organism's address, and then niche being an organism's occupation or job. So no two species share the same niche. So each species has a different job or role that it plays inside of its environment. So again, this is not something you need to know for chapter 3, but this is something just to keep in mind as we go through the ecology unit. We call this the competitive exclusion principle. So no two species will have the same job. They'll either live in a different, so they all might live in the same tree. So the warbler, they all live in the same tree, but they're different species because they inhabit different parts of that tree. And they'll never really go into the other parts where the other species live. And so we consider them different species. So all living things use energy. So the earth is solar powered, and that's basically the indirect source of energy for everything in the biosphere. So it's the main source of energy for life on earth, because that's where energy will start. So all living things use energy. We know autotrophs, so what you can think of is automatically make their food, so they are our producers. They can make their own food. Most autotrophs are going to use a process we've already talked about, so that's photosynthesis to capture solar energy. So main producers on land are our green plants. In water, it's our algae. Some autotrophs can make their own food in the absence of light, and if you guys know from our vocab review, they use energy stored in chemical bonds of inorganic molecules. So inorganic means not carbon containing, to produce carbohydrates. So we call that chemosynthesis. So a lot of our bacteria that live in those hostile environments, so volcano vents, hot springs, marshes, those are going to be the organisms that go through chemosynthesis. So heterotrophs are our consumers. So heterotrophs, we need to consume things in order to get energy. We have different types of heterotrophs. So heterotrophs that only eat plants. Hopefully you would tell me that that was an herbivore. Heterotrophs that only eat animals are carnivores. And then heterotrophs that eat both plants and animals, we consider omnivores. Okay, so we also have heterotrophs that feed on plants and animal remains. So we have mites, earthworms, snails, crabs. We call those detrivores. And then heterotrophs that break down and absorb organic matter, so bacteria and fungi. So they basically break it down, absorb it, and then they feed it back into the system. We call those our decomposers. So energy flows through an ecosystem in a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by being eaten. So we start off with our producers. And our producers, we're always going to see, they're going to be our most abundant source of energy. So if we look at a energy pyramid, you're going to see them at the bottom, and we're going to see the most amount of them in regards to biomass, because we need the most amount of them to sustain the quaternary consumers. Okay, and so then we go from producers to our consumers, and we always point our arrows in the direction in which energy flows, so from producers to consumers. And when we draw this, we are drawing right here is an individual food chain. You only see a series of a few organisms and how they're eaten through that chain. So the primary producers are eaten by primary consumers. So an arrow would be drawn to those primary consumers. Then the cricket would be eaten by the secondary consumers, so the carnivore. So we see that, I don't even know what that is. Is that like almost like a gerbil? Some kind of rodent eating the cricket. And so then you would go into the tertiary consumers, which are the snakes, and then you go from quaternary or tertiary to quaternary. And the arrows would all be drawn towards where the energy is flowing. So in most ecosystems, feeding relationships are more complex. You don't just have one chain of how organisms eat. We have a food web that links all those chains together. So we know that a hawk, it potentially could eat a small bird, the shrew, a harvest mouse. Okay, so it has many things that it eats, so it's part of many different chains. So each step in a food web or chain we would call a trophic level. And producers always make up the first trophic level, or that bottom level, okay? And we make up that bottom level because we have the most amount of organisms at that level. We also have the most amount of energy at that level. So lower levels must be bigger to support the level above it. So only about 10% of the energy from each level is passed on. Okay, so the energy from the sun is going to be the direct source of energy for all life on Earth. So it's going to donate 100% of its energy to the primary producers. Then the primary producers can only pass on 10% of the energy they have. And then after that, only 10% of the energy that the primary consumers have can be passed on to the next trophic level. So that's 1%. And then as you keep going up, you lose you only pass on 10%. So you lose 90% of your energy. And basically, where it's lost or where it's transformed and then lost to the atmosphere is via heat. So some energy is used for life processes, but the rest of it is lost as heat. So what do we use that energy for? Well, we use that energy for active transport. So the sodium-potassium pump, endoexocytosis. We use it for movement, for the synthesis of biomolecules. So if you remember, synthesis just means the making of biomolecules. Okay, so this is it for chapter 3.1 through chapter 3.2, I believe. So I'll have some more videos for you, and we'll go over the biogeochemical cycles. Have a good night.